All right, everybody, it is 12:01, so we are going to get started here today. So I just want to say welcome to everybody. This is our first webinar with the Land O'Lake lecture series with the Cannon River Watershed Joint Powers Organization. I'm Ryan Lerman. I work with the University of Minnesota Extension. I am in Ag and Natural Resources, and I cover Rice and Steele County. This webinar is being recorded. We will send that recording out to everybody after it's done and kind of wrapped up. So if you missed a spot or if you want to go back and check something out, that option is available. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom, and we will get to all the questions at the end. And then today we are talking about the Rusty Patched Bumblebee. And we are joined by Teresa DeMars, who is representing the Cannon River Watershed Joint Powers Organization. And we are joined by Sami Dolan, who is going to talk about the Rusty Patched Bumblebee. And she is with the University of Minnesota Bee Lab as a researcher. So with that being said, I will turn it over to you, Teresa.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Can you see my screen? Okay. Okay. So, welcome everybody. My name is Teresa DeMars. I actually work for the Rice Soil and Water Conservation District, but today I'm doing double duty and also representing the Cannon River Watershed Joint Powers Organization. And our organization is relatively quite new. Back in 2016, the state of Minnesota decided to go to the watershed model to help out our soil and water natural resources. It used to be managed at each county. So each county had an individual plan. And then it switched to a watershed model because water, as you know, doesn't follow a county line. So the Cannon River watershed is made up of 6 counties: Rice, Goodhue, Le Sueur, Waseca, and Steele County. And then our organization also, it combines the efforts with county governments as well as soil and water conservation districts. So each one of those counties also has a soil and water conservation district, or SWCD as we're called. And together we have worked together to come up with a management plan for the entire cannon. There's also a couple watershed districts that are also involved in this effort, and that is the Bell Creek Watershed District and the North Cannon Watershed Organization, which is found in the northern parts of the watershed. So just a little bit about the Cannon River Watershed. It's almost 1 million acres, and about half those acres are agricultural lands, and 10% of the acreage is within a metro area. We also have 800 linear miles of rivers, and the Cannon River and the Straight River down in Steele County make up the major rivers in this watershed. And then we have some different lobes of the cannon that have slightly different usage. The Straight River has a little more ag land. The Upper Cannon, there's a lot of lakes and wetlands. The Middle Cannon is urban, and the lower Cannon has some forested land in it. One of the biggest things that we're trying to do to help improve water quality in the Cannon River watershed is fixing erosion problems. So we're working with farmers and rural landowners to fix these areas. And we do that through a couple different ways. We do a lot of structural conservation practices, which include things like grassed waterways and water and sediment control basins. And then we also do non-structural conservation practices such as cover crops and conservation tillage. And these practices aim to cover the soil and mulch the soil. They help to improve infiltration and prevent the soil from eroding away into our waters. We also do a lot of outreach and education, primarily to farmers and rural landowners, but also in the Lakes region to homeowners. We have an effort to try to get natural native plantings along lake shores to improve septic systems, those types of practices. So again, the lakes and rivers in the watershed are a really important resource that a lot of people use. So we've been conducting shoreline surveys, septic inventories, developing lake management plans that have specific practices in them to help improve water quality. And we're doing further testing and monitoring to see if what we're doing is making an improvement. And then one thing, which is a really nice segue into the Rusty Patched Bumblebee, is, again, I mentioned we're trying to do native shoreline restorations. And one of the benefits, besides water quality, is that we're helping our pollinators. And so we're really excited to learn more about the Rusty Patched Bumblebee. So I will stop sharing for now and hand it over to Sami. You're muted, Sami.
Thank you. I just went on a tangent about the Cannon River. I was saying I appreciated learning a little bit about the Cannon River because last spring I spent a lot of time looking for dwarf trout lily near the Cannon River, which is a cool plant. I did not find it, but I will try again one day. So yeah, thank you for that little segue. Yeah, hi everybody. My name's Sami. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an entomologist and researcher with UNB Lab. And I'm very happy to be here today to give an info dump about Rusty Patched Bumblebee. I've been given 40 minutes of time to talk about Rusty Patched Bumblebee, its habitat, its life, and its story. So I'm excited to share a little bit of that with y'all. Okay, so I thought since I'm going to be talking for 40 minutes, I thought it would be nice to share a little bit about me so I'm not just some random person talking about bees. I'm an entomologist, I'm an educator, and I'm a natural history nerd. I love insects. I love learning about insects and sharing that knowledge with others. And I really, really love learning about the basic biology of different organisms, the natural history of them. I love kind of setting that foundation to ask bigger questions about the natural world. I'm very interested in native bee nesting biology. I would say that's like my primary area of expertise and interest. I moved here to Minnesota in 2021 to do my master's degree on bumblebee nesting habitat preferences in Minnesota, and I really loved that project. And overall, I really like teaching about the land that we live on and the organisms we share it with. I also just wanted to talk just a teeny bit about the Bee Lab and the people that I work with. These are the two people I work very closely with, Elaine Evans and Elise Bernstein. We primarily work on a big project called the Minnesota Bumblebee Nest Quest, which is a volunteer community science initiative to learn more about bumblebee nests in Minnesota. This is a pretty cool volunteer opportunity. I'll talk a little about it a little more later if I have time. But yeah, that's kind of primarily what I'm working on, and I spend a lot of time, surveying for bumblebees, learning about bumblebees, and sharing that information in places like this. So 40 minutes is a long time to talk, so I kind of just want to give a little bit of an expectation of what you're going to get out of this talk. I'm going to start this talk by talking about bumblebees at large, talking about who they are and kind of giving us in the mindset to be thinking about bumblebees. So once I give a little background information about bumblebees, I'll start talking about the Rusty Patched Bumblebee and give an overview. And I'll talk about some things like past and present Rusty Patched Bumblebee research and actions. Some of it will be somewhat surface level, some of it might be kind of in depth. And then at the end, I'm hoping to talk a little bit about Rusty Patched Bumblebee habitat, talk about some flowers that it likes to use, talk a little bit about nesting and overwintering, and maybe just give a few garden suggestions from my perspective as a bee biologist and also a gardener. So, bumblebees at large, the humble bumblebee. Here in the United States, we call bumblebees bumblebees, but I think it's interesting in the UK, they're called humblebees, and they are a very humble organism despite their size. I love thinking about bumblebees and these adjectives of fuzzy, colorful, loud, large, and really cute insects. They're very hard not to want to just pet sometimes. I really love their genus name Bombus, which means booming in Latin. And if you've ever been around bumblebees, you know that they are very loud and sometimes they are indeed booming. Across the world, there's 260 different species of bumblebees. And so not the biggest group of insects, but still notable in size. And bumblebees come in all different shapes and colors. Here in North America, we have 46 species of bumblebees. And in Minnesota, particularly, we have 25 species, which is over half of the species in North America, making Minnesota a bumblebee diversity hotspot. If you're interested in bumblebees and interested in learning about bumblebees, you're in a very good place to do that. Minnesota is unique in the sense that there's northern boreal forest, there's western tallgrass prairie, there's eastern deciduous forest, all kind of meeting together here in this area known as Minnesota. And with all those different habitats, there's lots of different bumblebees that come with it. So we're in a pretty cool spot. When I was thinking about the Cannon River, my brain goes to Cannon Falls sometimes. I've spent a little time in Cannon Falls and looking at the river, so my connection to the Cannon River kind of stems there. And I used iNaturalist to just get an idea of like how many species are in the Cannon Falls area and the Cannon River area. And this quick little search of a circle that I made here gave 16 different species in this area of Southeast Minnesota. And I say at least 16 species because I think there is potential for a couple more, but this is to say there's a lot of diversity in Southeast Minnesota and in the Cannon River watershed. So it's a pretty cool spot. I love the Southeast Minnesota. I love the driftless zone, and I think the Cannon River is pretty cool. Bumblebees are highly responsible for the pollination of a lot of different plants. Pretty much anywhere you go and you see a flower, you're very likely to see a bumblebee. They pollinate some of our favorite plants like tomatoes and blueberries, and they pollinate so many native plants. Bumblebees are unique in one, that they have a large colony size. So that means as a eusocial organism, they have sometimes 1,000 workers being born from a single nest, which means there's a lot of bumblebees on the landscape. They also have this cool ability called buzz pollination, where they can grab onto flowers like shooting star or tomatoes or anything in that kind of family and shake the pollen out of them using their flight muscles. And it's called buzz pollination because they make a really loud buzzing when they're doing that and using their flight muscles to shake that pollen out, which is why they're such effective pollinators of tomatoes. And tomatoes rely on bumblebees a lot for pollination. When it comes to bumblebees, I always like to think about bumblebees using 3 different kinds of habitat to complete their life cycle. I'm just going to quickly talk about a few of them just to give some context as we're going into Rusty Patch. Bumblebees utilize foraging habitat where they're getting their food to bring back to the nest. They utilize overwintering habitat where they are spending their winter and getting ready for a winter in Minnesota like we are kind of right now in that phase of their life. And nesting habitat where they're going and building their home and their nest where they raise their young, and the queen resides. Foraging habitat varies for a lot of bumblebees because bumblebees are such strong flyers and are able to use so many different habitats for foraging. This is one of their specializations. You know, insects are not generally super mobile insects or organisms, but bumblebees are unique in that they can fly really far away. There's been bumblebees documented to fly up to 1 kilometer away from their nest to forage in search of flowers, which is, you know, over half a mile. For an insect and an organism that is like this big, that's pretty impressive to fly such a long distance in search for food. When it comes to nesting habitat, bumblebees are pretty particular. Bumblebees don't create hives in the same way that a honeybee does or a wasp like in a tree. Bumblebees are not great at building and they're not great at digging, so they need some sort of pre-constructed cavity to make their nest. And oftentimes they're using things like rodent dens and rodent holes to make their nest. These are insulated, these are protected, and they're already built. And so bumblebees are very attracted to this. This is a picture right here of a bumblebee going down into the ground in a forest habitat, into a tunnel, supposedly where its nest is. And then this is a picture of a bumblebee sitting on top of this little grassy dome that a rodent constructed in the year prior. And the bumblebees are actually on the surface under this dome where their nest is. So abandoned rodent dens and like rodent substrate are really important for bumblebee nesting habitat. And last but not least is overwintering habitat, which is where we're at right now with the bumblebee life cycle. Bumblebees really like having loose soil with leaves and mossy patches, things that are easy to manipulate for them so they can find an insulated and concealed space. I just said that bumblebees are not great diggers, and that is true, but they are capable of digging, kind of a small little cavity for themselves to get under the soil, let the snow come on top of them and insulate them, and survive the winter. So if you are at this talk, you have probably heard before that bees are declining. Bees, it's the hot topic of like the bee decline, honeybees are declining, all these bees are declining, and bumblebees are not an exception of that. There's been lots of documented cases of bumblebees declining throughout North America and Europe. And this is driven by, kind of like in my mind and in the bumblebee community, 4 different things. There's climate change, pesticides, habitat loss, and disease. These 4 things all together have been all linked to bumblebee decline. And I'm going to talk about a few of these, in the context of Rusty Patched Bumblebee. Which brings us to this bee, the Rusty Patched Bumblebee. Its scientific name, Bombus affinis. You may hear me refer to Rusty Patched Bumblebee as affinis throughout this talk. So just warning of that now. Affinis is the species name of Rusty Patched Bumblebee. And this is the state bee of Minnesota, and it's been the state bee of Minnesota since 2019. So as a state, we are prideful of this bee, this really, really beautiful bee. Rusty Patched Bumblebee is generally active from the months of May to September when it's coming out of hibernation, looking for a place to build a nest, building that nest and completing its life cycle, and then going back into overwintering in September. Like all bumblebees in North America, Rusty Patched Bumblebee is on an annual life cycle, so it takes this 1 full year to complete the life cycle. And this is a very recognizable bee when it comes to bumblebees and the bees of Minnesota. So I thought I'd just give like a pretty quick crash course on Rusty Patched Bumblebee identification, especially if we're going to be, looking for ways to improve Rusty Patch habitat in the watershed. We want to be able to know when we're seeing this. So the Rusty Patched Bumblebee has these 2 characters that are pretty recognizable. The Rusty Patched Bumblebee name is not just for show. It does have this signature rusty patch on the abdomen. It's kind of sandwiched between these like kind of yellow bits here. You can see it kind of forms this W shape. So the rusty patch is signature on the workers and the males. And also this kind of more slept on character is this thumbtack shaped thorax coloration. You see this black coloration. It has this big circle with a little black going down the thorax. This is very helpful in addition to the rusty patch, especially when maybe the rusty patch is covered by the wing. So I always, when I'm looking for Rusty Patched Bumblebees, workers and males, I'm looking for these 2 characters specifically. And you can differentiate workers and males from each other. So here's our picture of our worker right here. On the male, they oftentimes have this like kind of little yellow on their head. This looks like a mohawk in this picture, but they often have a little more yellow on their head. And something to note about males is they don't have a pollen basket. Males do not return to the nest once they leave, and they don't collect pollen like workers do. So if you're seeing an absence of a pollen basket or no pollen in combination with the yellow head, you might be seeing a male instead of a worker. But it still does have that thumbtack shape and the rusty patch. But things in nature and biology are never simple. With the rusty patched bumblebee queens that we see in the spring and fall, they're actually lacking the rusty patch on the abdomen, which is pretty inconvenient when you're learning about rusty patched bumblebee, but there still are ways to tell the difference or to identify rusty patched bumblebee when it's a queen. One is that there's yellow on the abdomen just like this, and you can see this segment of the abdomen is really big, and generally these are such big insects. They have pretty short hair, and they have this small, really small dot thorax coloration of black. So it's a lot of yellow and just a little bit of black, and they are very velvety and fuzzy bees. And my quick comparison to another common species is the half-black bumblebee, which has a similar color pattern, but I really love these two pictures because you can see the velvety short hairs of the rusty patched bumblebee queen and the shaggy long hair and the yellows on the head of the half-black bumblebee queen. So when I'm looking for a rusty patched queen, very rare to see one of these. I've only seen one in my life. They're velvety, they're big, and they're lacking any yellow hair on their head. I'm very glad this is being recorded because that was quite a crash course. So I hope you can refer back to that if you want later. But now that we kind of, set ourselves up with learning about who Rusty Patched Bumblebee is, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the story of its decline because the Rusty Patched Bumblebee is a very hot topic. When it comes to bumblebees, it's this once common bumblebee that is now rare. And maybe you've heard that this bumblebee has decreased in abundance so much, and it decreased very, very rapidly in a really alarming amount, which has caused this bumblebee to become listed as critically endangered on the ICN Red List, which is one of my favorite resources for looking at endangered species. And it was federally listed as federally endangered in 2017. It's actually the first bee species to be listed on the Endangered Species Act in the United States. So an unfortunate milestone, but an important step for recognizing that this bumblebee is in decline and is at risk of extinction. So the story of the Rusty Patched Bumblebee is that pre-2000s, this was a pretty common bumblebee. It was kind of everywhere, especially on the East Coast. And this map is just showing the previous range of the Rusty Patched Bumblebee. You can see it was kind of extending all the way down the East Coast to Georgia. Here, it's here in the Midwest. It's in Canada. It was a pretty common Eastern bumblebee. Now, here's a map of it post-2000s, and the range has shrunk so much more. These blue dots representing observations of Rusty Patched Bumblebee. This bumblebee is almost completely absent from the East, minus a small population in Appalachia, and is now only really residing in the Midwest. This is kind of its stronghold of Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So quite a drastic change in range. It is likely extinct over here and is hanging on in these two disjunct populations. So something that everyone wants to know is like, what happened to Rusty Patched Bumblebee? Why did it decline so quickly and so suddenly? So like I was saying, pre-2000s, the Rusty Patched Bumblebee was common across much of its range. Like this was a common bumblebee. And I talked to my colleague. I'm going to be referencing my colleague, Elaine, a lot because she's been working in the field for a while. And I like hearing her stories about how common this bee was. She was like, this was a common bee. And it really did just disappear very quickly. It was possibly started declining in the 90s. Some things that are linked to this decline is the rearing of commercial bumblebee populations. If you remember what I was saying earlier, bumblebees are really great pollinators of tomatoes. And farming industries, agriculture industries found this out and were like, whoa, we should rear these things and grow tomatoes in greenhouses and release bumblebees into the greenhouses, which is like, cool, great idea. Although sometimes when you're rearing insects, they escape captivity and, cause some problems. So there was kind of this failure of rearing the Western bumblebee, where it just kind of wasn't working out for a while in 1990 and 99. And then all of a sudden, around the 2000s, the Rusty Patched Bumblebee, along with two related bumblebees, the yellow-banded and Western bumblebees, kind of just disappeared. We're starting to disappear like crazy. So it was kind of like, why is this happening? And there's some theories, and one of the leading theories is that there was a spillover of disease from these commercial populations of bumblebees. When you are transporting bumblebees between North America and Europe, breeding them in close spaces, disease is likely to break out. And this is probably why the Western bumblebee didn't end up to be a good candidate for greenhouse production of tomatoes. Likely got very sick. And with the timing of the decline across the subgenus Bombus of those three bumblebees I just mentioned, it's likely that it's possible that disease escaped this commercial production and into the wild population. That's one of the leading theories, is that disease is what is causing this decline. We're still trying to find links and evidence of this strain and diseases of being in commercial and wild bumblebees, and we know that the decline of the Rusty Patched Bumblebee could have started earlier. And some drivers of this are also climate change, pesticides, especially with the increase of neonicotinoid use in the agricultural areas, and of course habitat loss. The reality of the Rusty Patched Bumblebee decline is that it was sudden, it was fast. We think it's a big part of it is disease, but what we do know is that all of these different things are threatening the Rusty Patched Bumblebee with extinction. And so that's kind of some sad news about the Rusty Patched Bumblebee, is like, yeah, it's like going extinct. However, there are things that we have been doing as a Rusty Patched Bumblebee community to monitor this insect, learn about it, and learn about how we can protect it. So that's kind of, shifting gears here into the action that we're taking to protect this really awesome bee. And I'm going to be speaking a little bit from a historical standpoint here. Again, my colleague Elaine has done a lot of work with bumblebees, especially in the Twin Cities. And in 2011, she helped to start this program called the Twin Cities Bumblebee Survey, which was this initiative with volunteers and the Bee Lab to learn about what are the bumblebee populations looking like in the Twin Cities, what species do we have, how many of each one is there, and specifically, is Rusty Patched Bumblebee present here, and how much of there is it? And so you can see Elaine, with the help of volunteers, everyone working really hard to identify bumblebees in these really high-tech pieces of equipment called Tupperware. Not really high-tech, they're from a kitchen, but these are a really great way to catch bumblebees, identify them safely, and release them upon identification. So this was from this summer. I did the same technique in 2025 that Elaine was doing in 2011 to, look for different bumblebees. And I did find a Rusty Patched Bumblebee this year at Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden in Minneapolis. So that was like one of my few Rusty Patches this year. But this is kind of, the general thing is we want to learn about who's here and how many is here. So one of the questions that Elaine had when doing this Twin Cities Bumblebee survey was, how are local populations of Rusty Patch doing? And are there signs of recovery? What's the trend of this population? So just to share a little bit of her data, something that she found was that it was a consistently low occupancy of sites. On the y-axis here is how many sites there were for each year. So 2018 had almost 30 sites. So the yellow bar on this is how many sites had Aphanus versus the gray, and the whole bar is the total sites. And you can see the yellow is small, which means not very many sites, or there were not very many sites with Aphanus. And then with that, at like a certain site, they were kind of blinking in and out. Some years we would see bumblebees at Como, and sometimes we would see them at Lindale. whatever those two sites are. This was in 2011, so I wasn't here for this, but sometimes they would appear one year and then the next year they would disappear. And, that was not making a ton of sense to us. It wasn't giving us many answers about Rusty Patched Bumblebee. Kind of what Elaine came to was populations are hanging on, but they're not really like strongly bouncing back. They're just kind of here and hanging on. So this initiative in the Twin Cities started this kind of campaign to learn about bumblebees in the cities and eventually became something called the Minnesota Native Bee Atlas, which was more of a statewide approach to learning about bees in Minnesota. This was started by Dr. Robert Blair and the Environmental Natural Resources Trust Fund to kind of create an initiative, same kind of deal with volunteers, is to learn about the native bees in Minnesota. And, going from an urban scale to a statewide scale was important because, there's a lot of bias when you're looking in urban areas in the sense that there's a lot of people looking. And so a lot of our data is like, okay, we're seeing aphanus in urban areas in high numbers, but why aren't we seeing it in the rural areas? Probably because there's not as many people looking. And so something people are asking, this is research that's still happening now, is like, is aphanus associated with urban areas, or is this just some bias through our surveying? And this is a little graph here that shows basically the closer these organisms are to, or these points are together, is the kind of habitat they like. So these species over here like wetlands, these ones like grasses, and then these two species, Aphanus and Arcomus, are more associated with developed habitats. But I wonder, is that really true? It's possible, but that's something whether we're learning about right now. One of our grad students in the lab, Mary, is asking this question specifically and is going out into rural areas and urban areas across the Midwest and surveying kind of equally to learn about, is this association with urban areas really true, or are we just biased in our surveying? So that's kind of, where the Native Bee Atlas has taken us and kind of some of the work that's happening here in the lab with Rusty Patch. So Native Bee Atlas was really cool and has become this new thing called the Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas. And this is in conjunction with Xerces Society and the Minnesota DNR. And this is a big project. This is not just a Minnesota project. This is a big volunteer initiative to document bumblebees in North America and the United States. And Minnesota is just one part of that. This is a volunteer initiative of community science. That is something you can be involved in. Bumblebeeatlas.org is a great place to start. And this has become so big since I started and kind of getting into the bumblebee community in 2020. This has really taken off, and this data is really great. For me, I reference it all the time, and I encourage folks who want to learn about bumblebees to maybe look into learning about the Bumblebee Atlas so we can learn more about Rusty Patch and other bumblebees statewide. So all of those monitoring techniques I just talked about were very focused on finding bumblebees in their foraging habitat, catching them in those Tupperwares, and identifying them. But like I was talking about earlier, there's many different kinds of habitat that bumblebees need to complete their life cycle. And one of these is their nesting habitat. One thing about nesting habitat is that it is very difficult to identify bumblebee nesting habitat. Bumblebee nests are very hard to find, especially when it's a rodent hole in the ground that might be like this big. That's hard to find. That's hard to see a bumblebee going in and out at the right place in the right time. So that's a rare thing to find. On top of a rare bumblebee, the Rusty Patched Bumblebee, finding a Rusty Patched Bumblebee nest is difficult. And it wasn't until relatively recently that people in our community were learning about Rusty Patched nests. This is a really great email that Elaine got in 2020 where Nancy was like, there's these bumblebees going in and out of my house, and I think they're living in there, and I think they're Rusty Patches. And sure enough, they were. And this was an awesome, I'm sure this was an awesome email to receive if I was Elaine, because this was an opportunity to see this really rare event of a Rusty Patched Bumblebee nest. And so this is a pretty cool video of this nest back then. Those are some pretty big bumblebees, if you ask me. So I think this is pretty interesting. But the event of a nest being found had the bumblebee community mobilizing, because it's like, oh my God, somebody found this really rare and cool thing. We have to document everything we can about it. The DNR was there, the Fish and Wildlife Service was there. You know, everyone was there to learn about this nest. There's so much we can learn about Rusty Patched nest. So just let this video play a little longer because it's pretty cute. That's a really nice male coming out of the nest. She's just chilling. But when it comes to nests, there's so much that we can learn from finding one nest. And this is a super busy graphic, but basically what this is saying is when we find a nest, we can learn about the habitat bumblebees are nesting in. We can learn about how big the nests were. We can learn about what kind of food the bumblebees were eating. Can think about, you know, what's the genetic profile of these colonies. And so much other information can be taken from a nest observation. Generally, there's not a lot of information on bumblebee nests, and even more or even less so when it comes to Rusty Patched Bumblebee nests. There's like so few publications on Rusty Patched Bumblebee. There was like a bunch in like the 60s when people had more time and bumblebees were more common. And then there was a gap, and now it's kind of like we're in the modern, 2021 to 2025, and there's still very few, but we are occasionally getting to learn about this cool life history of this insect. One of the largest nests ever reported was a nest the size of 1,341 bees, which is pretty big for a bumblebee nest. And you can see this is a picture of what a nest looks like once it's excavated. And once we excavate it and bring it back to the lab, we can learn a lot about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can learn from a nest. Here's kind of the list of nests that have been found in the Midwest since 2020. There's been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 nests. This map is a little out of date, but not very many, and they're kind of all over the place. And this year, no one found a Rusty Patched Bumblebee nest, which was a bummer. I don't think that means that this year was any worse than the previous years, but when it comes to nests, it's a lot of time, right place, right time, and luck. So hoping in 2026, maybe more nests are found. I was very lucky when I first moved here to get to go see the 2021 La Crosse, Wisconsin Rusty Patched Bumblebee nest. And I thought this was a very interesting nest. It was located in a forest. La Crosse is in the driftless zone. And so this nest was located like on this steep kind of rock wall thing. And it was literally living in like some sort of cave here, pretty big entrance. And I got to see the bees coming in and out of the nest. And this nest definitely was feeling kind of sickly. The bumblebees would kind of come out and stumble around, and they had deformed wings. So it makes me wonder, was this nest affected by pesticide runoff, or was there some disease in the nest that was making it sick? Pretty cool to see. And at that nest, we got to take some things called tarsal clippings of the bumblebees coming out of this nest to learn a bit about the genetic diversity of Rusty Patched bumblebees. Finding Rusty Patched Bumblebee nests is a really great way to collect genetic data, which is helpful for learning about how different are the different populations of Rusty Patched Bumblebee in the Midwest. Is there inbreeding, or is the genetic population pretty diverse? And generally, it's good to not have an inbred population. It's good to have a diverse set of genes because it helps you protect you against all kinds of things like diseases. And so I just want to share this kind of interesting study by this guy named John Mola, who researches a lot about the genetic diversity of Rusty Patched bumblebees. And he did a cool study where he went to all these different places where Rusty Patched Bumblebee is being found nowadays. And he wanted to document the different populations of Rusty Patched. He was like, I want to know where the unique populations are. And something to take away from this map is Southeast Minnesota, right here, these blue dots, is considered its own unique population. It has its own unique set of genes. You can see the Twin Cities has its own thing. Appalachia has its own thing over here. And then there's these other kind of populations. So it's pretty cool that Southeast Minnesota is considered to have its own little population. The question with this research is how related are different rusty patch populations? This is a similar graph to that one earlier about the urban stuff. If dots are closer together on a graph, they're more related. And so basically what we're seeing is a lot of isolated Appalachia dots over here that are not very related to the glob of Midwest populations here. We can see a lot of these purple dots up here that represent the Twin Cities, kind of isolated on its own. And then here's Southeast Minnesota, kind of right in between the relatedness of the Twin Cities and pretty much everything else in the Midwest here. So it's kind of maybe forming a bridge in gene flow between these two populations. This is to say, Southeast Minnesota has a unique rusty patch population and is worth being protected. And for the last little bit of my talk, I guess I haven't been keeping track of time too much, but I think I'm good. Is talking about diet. And this is getting more into stuff that we as individuals can do to provide for Rusty Patched Bumblebee. We want to know what flowers Rusty Patched Bumblebee is eating off of and collecting pollen, so we know what to plant, right? And, you know, when we're looking in a Rusty Patch nest, we can learn a little bit about, you know, what they were eating. I really like this picture right here of a bumblebee with a big glob of purple pollen on its leg. I cannot think of what that plant is off the top of my head, but I do think of Siberian squill in the spring having blue pollen. You can sometimes see a bumblebee with big old blue pollen baskets. That might be what this is, to be honest. But I just thought that was a cute little image. But when it comes to learning about their diet, we always want to know what plants are important. What are the interesting plants to Rusty Patched Bumblebee? You know, I want to know what to plant for this thing in my garden. And this graph that I'm showing you right here is some data from 2 different nests of Rusty Patched Bumblebee from Southeast Minnesota, where they went into the nest itself and took samples of the pollen that was saved in the nest to learn about what they were bringing into the nest. And these nests in particular were interesting because so much of the diet was these invasive species, not things that we're like really wanting to plant in our garden. Some that I recognize here, Medicago is sweet clover. That's a pretty noxious weed. Trifolium pratense is red clover, also takes over a lot. But there are some, Silphium perfoliatum is cup plant, coneflower, some things in here that are native, but generally there's a lot of invasive species in here. So that makes you wonder, if we remove these bee preferred invasives, we need to make sure we're replacing them with native bee preferred flowers, because we can't just get rid of these invasives and put nothing else there. So then what are they going to eat? So that brings me kind of to the end of my talk. I'm going to just, you know, talk about the fun stuff of the flowers and give some data, observations, suggestions. This is another graph that's similar to that one we just looked at, but kind of a different way of collecting data. Was in Wisconsin, these folks looked at a bunch of different pictures of Rusty Patched Bumblebee posted on this Wisconsin community science thing called Bumblebee Brigade. And they identified the flowers that these insects were pollinating on. And they found all these different genera that Rusty Patch was foraging on. And a lot of these line up with some of my personal observations of what Rusty Patched Bumblebee likes to forage on. So this is kind of a combination of some suggestions that I like to see Rusty Patch on. Joe Pieweed, awesome summer plant, kind of late summer plant that bumblebees love to be on. I feel like when I first started learning about Rusty Patch, I saw them on Joe Pieweed all the time. Culver's Rue is a prairie plant that is great in the peak summer for Rusty Patched Bumblebee. Field thistle I always like to talk about because I think thistles are generally regarded as pretty noxious weeds, but we do have some native thistles that are loved by bumblebees, and one of those is field thistle. I love this plant so much, and pollinators love this plant, and I think it's beautiful, and I think thistles are super awesome plants. So sometimes it's good to have a thistle in your garden. Hyssop is a really great Rusty Patch Bumblebee plant. Again, that is kind of like, sometimes that's a forest plant as well as a prairie plant. So if you have like a shaded garden, this could be a good choice. I've seen Rusty Patch Bumblebee on cup plant before. Pretty easy plant to grow once you get it going. And I think one of the crown jewels, and you can see on this slide, Monarda is that huge bar at the top, which is bee balm. This plant, super easy to grow, super abundant in the summer, and Rusty Patch love it. They actually have a really unique way of foraging on this plant called nectar robbing, and no other insect or bee does this in Minnesota. Rusty Patch Bumblebee literally robs nectar from this plant. See the stamens and stuff sticking out of the front of these flowers here. And you can see how the Rusty Patch Bumblebee is like all the way up at the base of the flower. And if you look close here in this picture, you can see it's putting its tongue right into the, end of this flower, which I think is really interesting that they're sticking their tongue, they're chewing a hole in the flower and sticking their tongue in there and just drinking the nectar without collecting pollen. Why would you do that? Maybe it's easier. But something you can look for if you have Monarda in your yard is you can look for little holes that have been bitten into the bottoms of these flowers. And if you're seeing those holes in your flowers, probably have Rusty Patch Bumblebee close. So it's a way to tell if you have Rusty Patch without even seeing the bee itself. That paper where I showed that data also has some suggestions on early season flowers. I think bluebells are a really great resource for those spring queens. The early season is a really, really important time for those spring queens because they are coming out of the winter, they are hungry, they're cold, and they need food. Bluebells, Dutchman's breeches, bleeding hearts, and spirea were some of the top flowers that this research saw Rusty Patch Queens foraging on. And just bumblebees in general love these plants. I really love seeing bumblebees on Dutchman's breeches. And I just have like a few notes on nesting and overwintering considerations of bumblebees in general, but also Rusty Patch Bumblebee. When it comes to overwintering, it's important to have leaves in your yard and in your garden and loose soil. Like I was saying earlier, bumblebees like kind of need that like looseness to be able to manipulate their environment and find a spot for them to overwinter. If it's too packed down, they're not going to be able to dig because they're not good at digging. So if anything you take from this, bumblebees are not good at digging. I think grasses are really great to have in your garden. Things like big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass. These are like bunch grasses that they don't spread like your lawn grass, like Kentucky bluegrass. They kind of create a bunch. And a lot of times rodents use these bunch grasses to make nests and insulate their nests, and therefore creating habitat for Rusty Patch bumblebees and other bumblebees. And my little garden bias is I think messy gardens are great. I think it's great to have a messy garden where there's lots of different options for insects to live in. Some insects might want loose soil and leaves. Some insects might not want that. And I think having like a diverse selection of little microhabitats for insects is good for all kinds of organisms, including bumblebees. So don't be afraid to be lazy with your garden. And with that, I just want to plug a few like volunteer research opportunities. I talked about NestQuest earlier, where if you want to learn more and help learn about bumblebee nesting habitat, this is kind of the way to get into this. This was a Twin Cities program these last 2 years, but next year this program is hoping to go statewide. So like this is the year to get involved with NestQuest, learn how to find bumblebee nests and contribute to some much, much, much needed data about bumblebee nesting. I used iNaturalist in this talk to kind of give a summary of the bumblebees of Cannon Falls. iNaturalist is a great place to upload your photos of bumblebees. So, we can kind of compile these observations and learn about them that way. Bumblebee Watch is another more bumblebee specific program akin to iNaturalist that you can upload your photos. I love them both. And of course, there's the Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas, which I talked a little bit about earlier. Just look any of these up by name, and you can get started learning about how to get involved with some useful and real-time science. And with that, I want to say thank you for letting me lore dump about Rusty Patched Bumblebee. And my email's here. If you have questions or observations later, let me know. And with that, thank you. I'll turn it back over to Teresa, I think.
All right, thank you so much. I learned quite a bit. I had no idea there was blue pollen.
The blue pollen, it's
I
crazy.
know, that's crazy.
It's a very nice thing to see in the spring after you've been cooped up inside all winter.
Yeah. All right, I'll start. Thank you so much. I'll start sharing my screen again. And let's see. See if I can make it. Doesn't want to. There we go. So yeah, I have a little pocket of prairie myself as a way to segue back into my talk. And I got really excited a couple of years ago because I saw my first Rusty Patched Bumblebee at my place. And then last year I didn't see any. And then this summer I saw some again. So it was nice to see them again. And there's a lot of things we as homeowners can do to plant some of those flowers to help our pollinators and attract the Rusty Patched Bumblebee. So the first program I want to quickly talk about is the Lawns to Legumes program. And this is a real popular program for homeowners. It provides up to $400 in cost share mini grants to homeowners. It requires a 25% match from you. And the next deadline to apply for planting for next year is this November 30th. So in the follow-up email that I'll be sending out, I'll have links to these programs. So you can apply this fall and have a nice little grant to plant native early next summer. Again, I mentioned before that the Cannon River Watershed Joint Powers Organization has a native shoreland planting program. And this is for within 300 feet of a shoreline, you can plant some native plants. So this provides a $500 mini grant. There's no cost share involved, and you have to plant a minimum of 150 square feet of native vegetation. And approval is required from your local soil and water conservation district prior to planting or seeding. So with all these programs, you first have to apply for them. You have to get approved, and then you can do the planting. You can't plant first and then go and ask for money. So make sure that you follow the rules for each one of these programs. A lot of the different soil and water conservation districts, really across Minnesota, they have native plant programs where they will sell kits of native plants. And a lot of times there's multiple different kinds. So like if you have a wet spot, there's a rain garden or wet meadow planting kit, or if you have a shade garden, there's a shade garden kit. So these are really unique to local SWCDs, but you can usually get a pretty good deal on native plants. We also have a native plant contractor list, and that has a list of native plant nurseries across Minnesota. But I'd like to remind people that whichever nursery that you go with, it's a good idea to verify with them that their plants are neonicotinoid free, because a lot of nurseries will sell, the Monardas, the bee balms and stuff like that, but they might not necessarily be neonicotinoid free. So you should always ask. And then a lot of farmers markets and different chapters here in Rice County, the Wild Ones Northfield chapter and the Master Gardeners, they often will also have native plant sales, and across the Twin Cities as well. The only thing I can think of there is just to be aware of jumping worms. That's something that's starting to be spread. But those can also be a source for native plants. There's another program. If you have a little larger acreage, if you want to plant 2 to 25 acres and even beyond, they can help. The Bee and Butterfly and Bee Habitat Fund provide seed at no cost. They have a 5-year agreement. You have to keep that native prairie planted. And they also will walk you through the steps that you need to do to prepare the site and the maintenance afterwards. With any native garden that you plant, there is maintenance. The first, up to the first 3 years, you're probably going to be, even with a small garden that you plant in your backyard, you're going to be pulling weeds. So, and we all want to be good neighbors. We don't want a lot of those like quack grass and those different weed grasses to take over. We want to have the flowers growing. So it's important to definitely maintain your garden so that they're not calling the city on you. We've had that issue before, but so try to keep the weeds down and keep your native plants growing. If you have a really big site, for instance, let's say you have farmland and you would like to take a farm field and convert that into a prairie, there are a couple different federal programs that are available. And the 2 most popular ones are the Conservation Reserve Program, which is a 10 to 15-year easement. And then another one is the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. And that program takes at first a CRP easement and it piggybacks it with permanent protection. So you get both the CRP payment and then you get a lump sum payment, and you're basically selling away your development rights for that permanent easement program. So those 2 are federal, and I'll be passing along the contact information for our local county USDA contacts, but recognize that with the federal shutdown that you're going to have to wait till that ends, because all of those USDA offices in our area are shut down at the moment. And then USDA also has something called the Monarch Butterfly Conservation on Working Lands. So again, there's another program with a couple of agricultural conservation programs where they have practices in there that provide habitats for pollinators like the monarch. If you're protecting the monarch, you're going to be creating the same type of habitat that you would be pretty much for the Rusty Patched Bumblebee. So that's another opportunity to potentially plant native on your site. And then here in Faribault, if you live in the city of Faribault, the Partners for Pollinators group, it's a local group of native gardeners who have an effort to improve pollinator habitat in the city, and you can join the Be a Dot on the Map program. This is for Faribault residents, and you can receive a sign once you plant your native garden that highlights it to other people in the community to point out that you're planting habitat for pollinators. And so far we have about 30 native gardens in our community of landowners that have planted native plants. So it's really fun to see all these little native habitats popping up. I had the pleasure in August, and this brings me to a question for you, Sami. I'll kick off the question portion. We did a little tour for a church group in town, and we visited 3 native gardens, my garden, and a couple other of our local pollinator group. And it was a great August day, and we saw several Rusty Patched Bumblebees that day. And like I said, 2 years ago, I had a Rusty Patch, and then last year I didn't have any, and this year I seen Rusty Patch Bumblebees at my site for a couple weeks. They were there like every day, and then they disappeared. So I was just wondering, where did they go? This year they were on at my house. They were on echinacea, and then 2 years ago they were on stiff goldenrod, and the stiff goldenrod hadn't yet bloomed this year. And so I was thinking I would keep seeing them, but then I didn't. So I'm wondering, did they just, hopefully they just moved on to another site foraging? Do they, like you said, they covered a lot of ground. I'm hoping that they were just foraging and not completely disappeared.
Yeah, I think I bet you there are still Rusty Patch around. But it can be alarming when you don't see them for a year, especially when there's such news that they're disappearing. Um, it's likely that, you know, a nest was placed that one year where you were seeing them a lot. Maybe there was a nest close to you. Um, or like you're saying, the Saldago, the stiff goldenrod bloomed, you know, as expected, and this year was late. It's possible that the nest this year or a nest this year chose a different plant to forage on, and because maybe stiff goldenrod wasn't available. And the thing with bumblebees and their foraging is every individual kind of learns how to use a certain plant better than others, and they don't want to change from that. It's hard to learn how to forage on different plants. So I would say the most likely thing is that it's possible they're just foraging somewhere else. So it's if you're not seeing them year after year after year after year, that's when you would probably be alarmed.
Perfect. We'll kind of get rolling into the questions here. We're already after 1 o'clock. So one question here. So they're wondering, when you were showing the picture about the differentiation between males and workers, are workers males, or is there a difference, or they're kind of wondering about that?
Yeah, good clarification question. All workers are females. So queens and workers are all females. Males are sometimes referred to as drones. And yeah, they're a different thing from workers and queens. So there's like three castes, basically: queens, workers, females, and drones are males. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah. Another question. So when you were talking about grasses, is it better to like cut and leave those bunch grasses, kind of the material loose on the site, or do you just kind of leave it in place and not actually cut it at the end of the
Mhm.
year?
Yeah, I feel like both those strategies are good. The way I personally would probably go about it is I would just let the big bunch grass kind of do its thing on its own. Um, but if you want to cut it back and, you know, move that foliage somewhere else, I'm sure something would appreciate that or use it that way. Um, and over time, as you have bunch grasses in your garden or in like your little pocket of prairie, that leaf litter is going to like build up over time. So you might want to remove it sometimes and move it somewhere else, or even, you know, burn it, depending on the size of space you have.
Perfect. Kind of looks like the last ones are kind of more just comments. So if you're looking for those dwarf trout lilies, somebody suggested to look in Cairn Park. And so that's just a small park just to the west of near Strand Big Woods there. So
Cool. Good to know.
yeah. And then another one about a workshop coming up. If anybody's interested in Owatonna, it says Saturday, October 15th, but I believe it's Saturday, October 25th, and that's through the community education program. And that's all about putting rain gardens together. So,
Mhm.
and it doesn't look like there's any other questions coming in. So with that, I kind of want to just say thank you, Sami, for a great presentation. I really appreciate it. Definitely learned something about how to identify Rusty Patch better. I like those, kind of two things to look for on them. That was good.
Glad
So
about that.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me here.
Yeah, for sure. And then Teresa, thank you for talking about all the options there. If people are looking into, growing pollinator gardens or trying to support more habitat for bees, that's perfect. So
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks for hosting, and thanks, Sammy, for all your effort and your presentation. We really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you both.
yeah, for sure. And then everybody watch for the follow-up email. That'll have a link to the recording. It'll also have, I would assume, information for our next webinar coming up in November. Is that correct, Teresa?
That is correct. Jody DeLong Hughes from the University of Minnesota will be giving a presentation about why organic matter matters for increasing your soil health in your garden and on the farm. So we're looking forward to that presentation.
Perfect. So, all right. Well, with that being said, we're already past, like I said, so we'll just let everybody go here, and thank you both. So talk to you later.
All right,
Thank you.
bye.
Yep,
Y'all have a
bye.
good one.